Good evening. You're watching ThinkTech Asia, and this evening we're going to be talking about the possibility of China's grand strategy disaster in terms of foreign policy. And to help us with this discussion is the Executive Director of Pacific Forum CSIS here in Honolulu, Mr. Brad Glosserman. And Brad, nice to have you back on our show.
It's nice to be back, David. Thanks for having me.
You know, you're almost a regular here, and every time you're on the show, we get this explosive comments and interest. And the particular topic that we want to focus on today has to do with, you know, if you take the big picture of what China's been doing, it looks like the possibility of a big mess. And the issue is whether or not it is a deliberate policy, shrewd, or whether it's just an absolute make it up as you go, what the hell kind of situation.
That may be a little bit of an exaggeration, but there's the extremes. I think we can identify the two ends.
And so for our viewers that haven't had an opportunity or may not be up to speed on recent developments having to do with China around the region, what's been going on, how about set the stage for us and kind of lay out what's been going on so that they have the picture before we get into this issue. Is this a deliberate strategy or something else?
All right, well, in addition to explaining, I mean, what the story is about, let me also, I mean, I'm probably jumping the gun a little bit, but you know, there is this meta narrative of why we're here, right? Which is 2 weeks ago or a week ago, I published a piece in the National Interest, a blog that they called China's Grand Strategic Disaster, which I actually titled. My original title was a little less inflammatory, which was just Inexplicable China, because I looked at Chinese behaviors, and as I tried to understand, or tried to figure out what China was doing, or I saw what China was doing, I was trying to figure out why, and I couldn't come up with an answer.
Right, okay.
And so the what, which is, now we're back to your question, the what I kind of identify in three different levels. And the first is the deliberate, if you will, picking of fights, which is sort of the pugnaciousness, right? This is characterization.
The schoolyard bully type thing.
Well, again, let's not be. Let's save that kind of judgment until later.
Okay.
You can do that, but I'm going to try to be a dispassionate and objective analyst. But you know, I saw three different types of Chinese behavior that just don't make sense to me. Not certainly as a group. The first type is, if you will, the deliberate poking in the eyes. So what you have is the territorial conflict with Japan in the East China Sea over the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands. Right?
Okay, and so that confrontation is
right, and that's
ongoing.
You've got Navy ships right now. Earlier this week, you had aircraft buzzing each other. So a little, you know, gnarly situation. One in which actually the two sides could come into conflict. In the South China Sea, we move south, and we have similar kinds of conflicts with both the Vietnamese and with the Philippines, and they're over territorial disputes. And in one case, earlier this year, for example, you've had essentially the Filipinos have run a ship aground on a reef.
This is the Sierra Madre, right?
Yes.
And that's at
Johnson Reef, or
right. I think we have a picture of that, yeah.
Probably. And you know what you've had is a number of Filipino Marines living on this grounded ship as a way of
rusted hulk.
A rusted hulk of a ship. They've been there for about 2 years, I think, demonstrating that this is under territorial control. And the Chinese, every time they try to resupply these guys, they used to send boats, and Chinese play cat and mouse, and this time I think they dropped some supplies on them, and they had journalists watching. And so you have this, again, what looks to be a very potentially dangerous situation. And this is being replayed out on smaller features or islands or reefs or shoals throughout the South China Sea with the Philippines. There's 2 or 3 or more being disputed. And then in the last couple of weeks, what you've had in a similar territorial dispute with Vietnam was the decision by the Chinese to plant this monster drilling rig.
This is a billion-dollar piece of equipment.
Billion-dollar piece of equipment,
big piece
right?
of it.
That they've decided they want to explore and dig, see if they can, you know, pull some oil or natural gas out of these waters. And again, there is disputes as to whether or not this is you know, the Chinese claim the waters as they claim virtually all of the South China Sea. The rig, my understanding, is 120 nautical miles from the Vietnamese coast. Now, there are other features, Woody Island, I believe, in the Parasols.
Right. We have a map that, you know, kind of lays that out.
It's certainly claimed by the Chinese, and there's 12 nautical miles versus 40 nautical miles versus 80 nautical miles. To me, the killer is what's extremely important is it's 120 miles from the Vietnamese coast. And so it's easily within a 200-mile exclusive economic zone.
Right.
And so, you know, these questions of where the Chinese claim draw, which we've talked about in the past, the famous 9-dash line, all of this makes for some very confusing territorial claims and litigation. And so, you know, you've got these three what I consider to be really pugnacious pokes in the eye.
Well, you also have these hosing of the Vietnamese ships in connection with that.
Well, certainly with the oil rig, what's also interesting is you've had dozens, like up to I think 90 or 100 Chinese vessels, including some naval vessels, that have been sent out to protect the rig. And that's something of a fairly serious escalation in terms of you know, the firepower. And yes, they've been firing water cannon at each other. They've been ramming each other. I don't believe. I think there was one fatality. I think the last couple of days.
And they sunk a Vietnamese
right.
boat.
And so this is all an extraordinary formula for mischief, and clearly going to potentially lead to, you know, the great danger of confrontation.
Absolutely.
So those are the immediate, if you will, pokes in the eyes. A little less obvious, if you will, but nevertheless I think equally irritating in some respects, is in the last couple of weeks you've apparently had reports of a growing number of Chinese vessels or fishing boats that are now exploiting and taking fish out of South Korean waters. Particularly, it's the blue crab season, which is real delicacy.
Very lucrative.
Right, but this is being done at a time when the South Korean people are still distracted by the Sewol ferry sinking. So you know, you're exploiting a tragedy for your own particular gain and economic interest. You've recently, in the last 48 hours, you've had reports now that the contracts that the Chinese fishermen have signed with some of the North Koreans, and again, that takes them into disputed waters between South and North Korea. You now have the South Koreans coming south into the.
You mean the North Koreans coming south?
No, you have you have the Chinese via the North Korean contracts now coming into South Korean waters. So while they've signed contracts to fish in North Korean waters, they're now fishing in South Korean waters. So again, one more irritant.
Not quite a poke in the eye,
but it's still it's
a slap upside the head.
It's a slap in the head, and I think it's insensitive given the problems that South Korea is certainly having in regard to its maritime domain at this moment in the aftermath of this disaster. It's a bit of a problem. Then, while we're still swinging around on this particular less offensive but equally irritating, if you will, set of actions, you have the Chinese training vessel, naval training vessel, going into Malaysian waters and basically making declarations that these are Chinese waters, even though these islands are disputed by the Malaysians and that we will always defend them. So a poke in the Malaysian eye, which follows extremely aggressive and hectoring diplomacy with Malaysia in the aftermath of the disappearance of Malaysian Flight 370. Great insensitivity, it seems, to the problems that the Malaysian airlines and the Malaysian government is going through.
I mean, China's response was almost brutish in that having to do with that.
Rude.
That
rude. There's an element of understanding. I mean, you can certainly understand why Beijing is concerned. 150 of the 270 people on that flight were Chinese. And consequently, there were people, Chinese citizens pounding the table demanding answers, and Beijing has to be able to say, we're acting on your behalf. So, I mean, again, there are pressures, but why you do that, I don't know. And then finally, in this little basket of irritants, there is a similar claim to waters claim in the Natunas, claimed by Indonesia, which again strikes me as a somewhat gratuitous attempt to irritate and antagonize a neighbor.
What happened? What did China do vis-a-vis Indonesia that's new for our audience?
They made a claim to the possession of that these waters and these islands in this particular area were actually Chinese-owned, Chinese-administered by virtue of the famous 9-dash line, and there had been some uncertainty as to whether or not the Chinese claims extended that far. So the point that to me, which is important, is that in each of these cases, every single one of these, I'm not questioning the validity of the Chinese claim or the legitimacy or the legality of it. I mean, lawyers can do that. My point is that why do you do every single one of these things at the same time?
Why do you pick all these fights?
Why do you antagonize everyone at the same time? To me, that seems to sort of lack coherence. There is, by the way, a third group, I think, of behaviors that I consider troubling, which are more generic, that address issues such as the refusal to press North Korea to comply with United Nations Security Council resolutions and ongoing bad behavior by the North Korean government. There is the backing of Russia and the refusal to condemn Russia at the United Nations Security Council, even though the actions that Russia takes,
this is Crimea.
Crimea, I'm sorry, thank you, and Crimea and Ukraine run exactly counter to Chinese interests. That if Taiwan were to claim to have the legal authority to hold the referendum that the Crimeans did,
and vote the other way.
Well, however they voted, to go their own way, the Chinese would go absolutely ballistic. I mean, they completely deny that the people of China, or that the people of Taiwan, the 23 million of them, can make a decision of their own fate without the consent and without the say of the people from Ukraine, the rest of Ukraine. And that's exactly what the Crimeans did. And then the final and you know, the unwillingness of the Chinese to condemn that action and Russian support for that strikes me as being counterproductive, and again, aligning themselves on the wrong sides of history. And the third and final piece of that, of course, is Syria, and the siding with Russia in an attempt to block any sort of Security Council scrutiny or interference in ways that might challenge the Assad regime.
There's one other little piece I want you to talk about, Brad, and that is the reports that China is now funding opposition to the government in Myanmar,
thanks for teeing that one up. I clearly left it off my list. That, I think,
but I think that's important because
it is, and I identified it in the original article, and that is there are news reports, and again, difficult to substantiate, that in fact the Chinese government has been providing weapons to some of the rebels fighting in Myanmar, and that's important because the Myanmar government has made a swing in the last couple of years to, if you will, it's been traditionally for the last 20, 30 years, very closely aligned with Beijing.
They talked about it as a vassal state almost.
I don't think anybody would use that term, but that may be the unpolite way, or the way folks talked about it in back alleys in Beijing. But I think, you know, so this is an attempt by the Chinese, I think, it's generally reported, as a way of reminding the government in Naypyidaw, the Myanmar government, that you need to take Chinese concerns and that you cannot begin this courtship of the Americans and just cutting loose your old partner who supported us for so long. And we had these conversations in Myanmar. They actually tell us that, yes, we do have to remain cognizant of our friends in Beijing because they did provide us with sustenance for so long. So this, again, too, I think is another example of trying to play a particular hardball.
Okay, so we have that's the what. And so let me ask you, what's the why now? Why do they pick all these fights?
And that's what I don't understand. I mean, there's a number of explanations, possible explanations for this, and they all make varying degrees of sense.
Let's take yours first.
Well, mine is I don't know. Mine is that this is inexplicable, that there is incoherence within the leadership, and that a country that had been since Deng Xiaoping was the president, or was the supreme leader of China, you know, had the famous 16 characters, which essentially said, you know, hide your ambitions and bide your time.
This is Deng Xiaoping.
Deng Xiaoping.
Okay.
You know, keep a low profile. Do not, in keeping in many ways with Sun Tzu's famous, you know, admonitions of camouflaging your abilities.
Right.
Don't create enemies. Make sure that you are essentially building strength and wait until the moment is right, and that you can actually reveal yourself to be the power that you are. And I would, from my assessment, it's still premature. And all the conversations that I have with Chinese, they suggest as well that it is still too early for China, that they are not prepared to take on the United States, that they are still a developing country. And the insistence that the Chinese provide you at every moment is that the most important thing for China is its development, and consequently what is critical is that we maintain a peaceful, stable, regional security environment so that we can focus on that. And the Chinese say the best thing we can do is try to keep conflicts from bubbling up so that we and the rest of the region can get rich and fat and happy together. So the first argument would be incoherence, that these things are happening because they're on separate tracks and there isn't anyone in a position within
There's no plan.
There's no plan. There's no grand strategy.
Okay.
And that these decisions are being made discreetly, and by the time they bubble up to a position of where you're dealing with the ultimate decision makers in China, either A, they are not aware, if you will, of these little things, which I find hard to believe, or they are unaware of the implications, or more troubling explanation, one that I hear from friends within the diplomatic community when I was having this discussion, is that even the top leadership of China is not in a position to stop and say, wait a minute, we need to slow down, or we need to stop doing some of these things because they don't make sense for us in the big picture.
Okay, let's hold that thought, because we're going to go to a commercial break, and we'll come back, have you finish that, and then let's look at some other explanations as to why these events are happening. And we'll see you on the other side of the break. You're watching China's Grand Strategy Disaster. Maybe, maybe not. We'll see you on the other side.
Hi, my name is Dr. Rafi. Every week, I'm right here at ThinkTech Hawaii, 3 p.m. on Mondays. My show is Boris's Bio Briefings. What do we do here? Well, we watch sperm swim. We see if they catch anybody. We check out the latest biosimilars. You know, the kind that, what was his name, the guy with the bicycle? I guess we forgot his name, but he was taking EPO and other human growth factors. We'll be talking about human growth factors. You want to know where to get some? Maybe I'll tell. Anyway, you can catch me, as I said, every week right here, Monday, 3 p.m., ThinkTech Hawaii, Dr. Rafi. You can also find me on Twitter, BioInfo Medical. Or you can catch me on Facebook, Dr. Rafael Boritzer. I'll be happy to converse with you. Aloha.
We're back, and we've got with us in the studio Mr. Brad Glosserman, the Executive Director of Pacific Forum CSIS here, and we're right in the middle of a firecracker of a conversation having to do with the conundrum relating to Chinese foreign policy. Can it be explained, or is it just something that's out there, and people saying, what can Beijing be thinking, picking all these fights? And so right at the break, you were right in the middle of a sentence there having to do with the explanation that, or lack of explanation that you have for this situation.
Right. Again, for me, it's incoherent, and as a strategic design, I don't see it. So that's obviously one explanation, that in fact there isn't a grand vision, that you're seeing decisions that are made either independently of the leadership, of which it's either unaware and only in a position to ratify, or just kind of very random. A second explanation, of course, is that you have, for example, decisions made by particular constituencies. There are people, for example, that believe the PLA in the military is very powerful, and that it's pushing through a certain belligerence in these maritime domains, because that's where the PLA, and particularly the PLA Navy, would have some strength. So you
without coordination, without reporting, without oversight?
Yes, it would have to do with leadership dynamics.
Okay.
Okay, so that's a second explanation. A third is that no one is really, that the narrative of Chinese strength is such that even if some of the top leadership, even the top leadership, is unable to stop and say, we're making a mistake. And I find that a little difficult to believe. Even in the Tiananmen, you know, as we approach the anniversary of Tiananmen, it's worth remembering, even then we know that the Politburo was divided, the standing committee, that there was, what, a 3-2 vote on how to respond to the protests in Tiananmen. I find it difficult to believe that people would not be prepared in the current setting to stand up and challenge the wisdom of, we shouldn't be picking all these fights at once.
So that means there has to be some kind of lack of decision making, or lack of coordination?
Or power, groupthink could be, is certainly an explanation for that. There are other, you know, we're in a very murky realm of leadership dynamics, and it's hard to tell how the decisions are made within, at the upper reaches of the government. You would like to think that these people are intelligent, capable, and at least of recognizing the enormity of their actions and the possible consequences, and at least having an open debate among themselves, even if at the end of the day, you know, democratic centralism means that once the leadership is decided, we're all in agreement. You know, there are other explanations that could be offered. One, the very popular one, is that maybe they're aware of the potential consequences of their action, but you have such enormous social problems in China, consequently, that we need to be doing these things, picking fights to unify the country,
right,
and to identify the scapegoat theory, if you will.
Okay. So for our members of our audience who may not know, give us a sense of the type of social problems that China is facing that perhaps people don't know about. I mean,
the income gap in China, the inequality gap is as large as any country in the world. You have corruption of a scale that even the government, the top levels of the executive authority, acknowledge that this is the most corrosive influence on their legitimacy and their authority and has the potential to bring the state down. You have air, water, and soil pollution that has reached unfathomable,
catastrophic levels.
catastrophic.
Yeah.
I mean, most major cities in China do not have enough water. Soil pollution, there are hundreds of thousands of acres of land every year that become unarable. Years ago, it was recommended, or not recommended, there was a World Bank study that was subsequently withdrawn from circulation that concluded 750,000 additional deaths a year because of air pollution in China, and the situation's only gotten worse. So, you've got the environmental problems. You have
The economy is.
well, I was going to say the economy is still going well, but there's real estate bubbles throughout the country. There are concerns about, again, this ties to questions of corruption, but there are, according to Chinese official estimates, over 200,000 incidents of unrest a year. And unrest can be anywhere from two people to more having a
So
demonstration.
these would be things like what? Labor, terrorism?
Terrorism, no. Terrorism would be terrorism. But unrest could be anything from a labor dispute to a land dispute to something. Most people don't know why we always talk about the double-digit increases of the People's Liberation Army. In fact, for the last 2 or 3 years, even
This
longer.
is budget increase.
The budget, I'm sorry, the budget increases of the People's Liberation Army, which has been 10, 12, 14%. The People's Armed Police has actually had a larger budget. And so this speaks, I think, to the uncertainties and to the concern that they have about keeping order. So you've got, in the face of all of these potential problems, you've got the argument that, well, nothing that a little war couldn't help. Let's direct our public, our anger.
Diversion.
Exactly.
Okay.
And I find that interesting and ultimately unpersuasive.
Why?
Well, you're not seeing the evidence that suggests a whole lot of public support for all of these different fights. I mean, yes, with the Japanese, but that's a lot of other history. There's very little indication that public opinion is driving these decisions, and the Chinese, quite frankly, have shown themselves perfectly capable, the government has, of manipulating public opinion and using it to its own effect. So I am skeptical to suggest that there is, in fact, a deliberate attempt to misdirect or to redirect the attention and the anger and irritation of the Chinese people against foreigners.
Okay.
You get anger at Filipinos when there's a bus hostage taking in Manila, as was a few years ago, and again the tourists on them are mostly Chinese. So you have a bit of anger at the Philippines at that point, but certainly not. I think most Chinese see the Philippines as essentially a marginal player, and so not really worth getting that angry about. So those are, I mean, to my mind, those are the potential explanations, with one exception.
And the exception would be the position put forth in this exchange of gunfire over this, the inexplicable view that you've taken by Mr. Hugh White from Australia.
Right, now we reach the meta-narrative. Again, so I wrote this article, and Hugh, then, who's an old friend, a former defense official and an academic, very, very, very thoughtful man, someone who I urge everyone to read.
He's a real strategic, global, geopolitical thinker.
And an Australian strategic thinker, too, and I think that's important to recognize, that Hugh is thinking in the interests of his country. But this is a guy who's a defense official who wrote defense white papers. He's no bleeding heart liberal pacifist, whatever. He always asks the right questions. He always follows his logic to its conclusions. You always are better off, in my opinion, reading Hugh White.
And so what happens is that
I write my article.
You write your piece, and he comes back.
He writes a response in a blog for a think tank in Canberra, and so he writes that, and he and I are both. There's an inside newsletter that comes to Washington, players, strategists, guys like me. So we fashion ourselves, and it's all sorts of gossip and people responding to the news. And so I had sent the editor my original blog post, and he published it. And then Hugh sends his and it gets published. And then he and I then respond to each other through this newsletter, and we go through 2 different rounds of that. And it's been a really wonderful debate. But what Hugh's argument is, and it's consistent with a larger argument that he's made in his book called The China Choice, which I think everyone to read for the clarity of the reasoning, even if not the conclusions. And Hugh's argument is that China is rising, and that China is a proud country that will not accept secondary status in Asia. that if it continues on its trajectory, it will continue to close the gap with the United States. The U.S. will continue to be the #1 power, and even when the Chinese economy becomes bigger. But nevertheless, China will reach a position where it will be better able to assert its national interests. And that a country with the history of China and the pride of China will not accept a place given to it in an American-created order.
They ain't going to back down.
Well, more than that, it's more just that they demand the ability to to create their own space. And in many ways, the crude version of what I think the Chinese want, and Hugh certainly seems to suggest, is the Chinese would like a Monroe Doctrine for Asia. And what they have articulated is this notion of a new type of major country or a new model of major country relations.
Okay, but Brad, for our audience, a Monroe Doctrine for Asia would mean what?
Well, that's
okay.
I'm getting. And what it means essentially is that China wants to be the big dog in Asia, that it is the leading power. And just as the Americans said that no other country will be able to establish itself and assert its interests within the North America or within the Americas, once we became a sufficiently large country, the China wants to have the same thing. And in which case, we are the interlocutor, we are the interloper in that particular formulation. So what it means is that the Chinese interests, concerns come first among all others. That when a decision is going to be made in Tokyo or Seoul or Manila or Hanoi, that the first question those decision makers make is what will Beijing think, not what will Washington think. And that they will be deferred to when it comes to the articulation and ultimate resolution of conflict, that Beijing's interests will come first. And what Hugh believes is that China wants to write the rules for Asia that correspond to its own national image, its own history, that respond to Chinese interests. They will not take a place that we, the Americans, give them in an order that we wrote after the end of World War II. That world is changed and gone. And so what Hugh proposes, mind you, is a alliance of four great countries: China, the United States, Japan, and India. We don't have to really, I don't think, parse that too much. But the point for our purposes is that in the last couple of years, China has articulated what it calls a new type of major country relations. And that is an attempt to work with the United States, because as best I can figure, we're the only major country that is interested in having this new type of relationship with. It wants to create this relationship to head off what is the rising powers dilemma, the Thucydides trap, or whatever you want to call it, which is when you have a world in which you have an established power and a rising power, that invariably their interests will clash, that they will come in conflict. And China says, we have studied history, and while we are the rising power and America is the status quo power, we will not. We wish to avoid the conflict that comes. So let us forge now, agree to a new type of major country relations that will blunt that conflict and allow us, instead of working like this, actually working together to create a peaceful, prosperous environment in which Americans, Chinese, and everyone else can prosper.
Okay, you lost me. And the reason you lost me was, and you lost the audience here on this, Brad, was because how does you square that attitude and that philosophy with the facts of what's been going on in these various schoolyard skirmishes that you described at the beginning of the program?
And truthfully, this is Hugh's argument, not mine. So I mean,
okay, all right.
No, it's what Hugh's argument is twofold. That in fact, for all of the flowery rhetoric of positive sum cooperation and avoiding zero-sum competition between rising and status quo powers, that in fact what the Chinese are saying is that we are entering a world in which Chinese influence will be increased, certainly in this region, and American influence will be diminished. And consequently, we are going to prevail, and we are going to create situations that demonstrate to the United States and that demonstrate to the rest of the world, and the region in particular, that we are in fact strong enough, and we are capable of asserting our interests, and the United States can't stop us. And that a new type of major country relations in this formulation means that assertion and the American acceptance of it. And so the argument would be that the Chinese see this as a natural outgrowth of this evolution of views. The second piece of that, either complementary or maybe supplementary to it, would be that they don't see these particular conflicts, each of these little pokes in the eyes, as rising to the level of creating the problems that I see, or that I think that they largely create.
And that those problems would not be sufficient enough to suck the United States into a confrontation with China over them, like a maritime dispute in the South China Sea, right?
Precisely, that they think that what the Chinese are demonstrating is that we can assert ourselves and we can assert our interests in ways that disadvantage the Vietnamese, the Filipinos, the Japanese, whomever. We can assert our national interests, and the United States can do nothing about it. Welcome to
the New World.
The New World.
You know, we'll have more on this. I want to take this when we come back and kind of look at the Washington or American perspective on this when we come back after the break, so stay with us.
Hi, my name is Dr. Rafi. Every week, I'm right here at ThinkTech Hawaii, 3 p.m. on Mondays. My show is Boris' Bio Briefings. What do we do here? Well, we watch sperm swim. We see if they catch anybody. We check out the latest biosimilars. You know, the kind that, what was his name, the guy with the bicycle? I guess we forgot his name, but he was taking EPO and other human growth factors. We'll be talking about human growth factors. You want to know where to get some? Maybe I'll tell. Anyway, you can catch me, as I said, every week right here, Monday, 3 p.m., ThinkTech Hawaii, Dr. Rafi. You can also find me on Twitter, BioInfoMedical. Or you can catch me on Facebook, Dr. Rafael Boritzer. I'll be happy to converse with you. Aloha.
We're back. You're watching ThinkTech Asia, and this evening's program is all about a provocative look at China's foreign policy. What does it really mean, and where is it going? And we've called this program The Potential for a Disaster. And we'll get to that a little bit further on. But right before the break, Brad, you were talking about an analysis of this whole series of events that have been going on in the region that look like Beijing foreign policy is in shambles, and with an explanation coming out of Mr. Hugh White out of Australia. And right at the break, Dr. Hugh White coming out of Australia, and talking about that China is making these little, relatively small moves that wouldn't, from their perception, rise to the level of bringing the United States into a direct confrontation with them. Right at the break.
Right.
Now, that, in order for them to do that, there must be a perception that they have as to how far they can push. And where does that come from? What are they thinking about the U.S. willingness to move, to act?
There's two parts of this. First of all, it's this great 6,000 years of tradition that says China's the Middle Kingdom, and it is truly returning to its rightful place in the region. So there is this whole psychological disposition, if you will, to say that China is the rightful leader. In more recent times, what you've seen, particularly since the end of since the beginning of the global financial crisis in 2007, has been a very quick Chinese recovery and, if you will, the political paralysis in Washington, the zigzagging policy from Bush to Obama, the entire sense that Washington and the United States political system is dysfunctional. And the result, and particularly watching the way that the economies have recovered, the U.S. bumped along with zero in a recession, zero growth, finally recovering in the last couple of years, and the Chinese roared back to double-digit growth.
Right.
And they've slowed down primarily because they understand the dangers of reheating. But the lesson that the Chinese took away from that is that America's time has passed, that our time is now, and that China has recovered, and this is a demonstration that the future belongs to us. So quite simply, what you have now is the belief, seeming belief, and this is Hugh's argument, and frankly, there's a lot of people that agree with Hugh, and I'm reluctantly troubled to find. I only have questions. I can't rebut a lot of what he says. But the belief among the Chinese is that it is our time, that we can do these things and the Americans can't stop us. And neither can any of these other countries. And that not only is there the, if you will, the realization of Chinese interests, We're drilling for oil, which is good for us. We are changing the status quo in the Senkaku Deltas. We are taking this reef from the Philippines. Not only is there the actual hands-on, if you will, but there's the demonstration that, and by the way, the U.S. can't stop us. That the great hope of the Obama administration, the U.S. alliance system, it is in fact unable to somehow change the tide of history. That's, I think, what's driving. That's Hugh's argument. A number of people, the argument is the Chinese are doing this because they can.
Meaning they look at Syria and other examples and they're calling Obama's bluff?
Well, I'm not sure how much they're studying what's going on elsewhere in the world. This is a very good question. But that's always possible. But I think they're certainly looking at the particulars of drilling an oil rig in Vietnamese waters and saying,
who's going to stop us?
How, and more importantly, how are you going to stop us? And I think that that's, at this moment, that's where we are. Yeah, this fact that the Chinese feel as though they've got the freedom and the latitude, and the ways of them being blocked and slowed are either things that won't be done or that the Americans can't do. I think one of the arguments that I made is that both, and the problem, well, as the Americans respond to this, there's a great deal of, I think, confusion, like people on my part saying, why is China doing this? It's inexplicable. Or there are people that are taking the opinion that, take Hugh's argument as to what Chinese intentions and motives are, but concluding, unlike Hugh, that instead of accommodating China in some ways and creating this larger system, that what the Americans have to do is stand up to them. And so what you have is a situation where both sides believe they're in the right, and that they cannot back down, whereas the other side can, should, and will back down. It's a very bad combination.
Very. Why is it a bad combination?
You mean other than people shooting at each other and dying? That's a pretty bad combination.
Well, that's the point I wanted you to make, is that you're with that type of misperception on both sides, you end up necessarily with a confrontation.
Yeah,
or odds are.
And the danger, of course, is, I used to think that the danger that we faced in the region was really one of misperception, that and accidents, as we had with the EP3 incident in 2001. We will do what we think is our right and believe is our right to do in terms of surveillance flights. And they can be inflammatory and irritants, but they are legal, at least according to international laws we interpret it. And the Chinese will send an airplane, and planes will sometimes go bump, as they did. We've seen, the reports are that there were Chinese and Japanese fighters coming within 30 meters of each other in the last week in some scrambling exercises over the Senkakus. Right. I don't know. I mean, it's one thing when they went bump with the Americans and the Chinese. I'm not quite so sure that China would be as restrained, perhaps, if there was an accident involving a Japanese fighter. And so, to me, the chief concern is that operating in this air and sea space, in these domains, in a limited space like this, that there was a chance that we would miscalculate. And even though nobody wanted a fight, that we would end up backing ourselves into one. What comes out of the discussion that I've been having with Hugh, and his argument is that it's not a danger of it's not misperception in an accidental sense. It's a misperception in a fundamental miscalculation of the equities that are involved in these situations, and whether the resolve of either side, and what in fact is necessary to demonstrate resolve. And that's, to me, that is the most dangerous and the most troubling component of this whole discussion that I've had, and I've thought it through, and argued with Hugh and with other experts, because a number of other folks have joined in, which is, if in fact the Chinese believe that this is their time, and if they in fact believe that we are weak, the Americans, or if not weak, unable to stop them from doing what they do.
For any number of reasons.
For any number of
political, economic, whatever.
And if it's important to China to demonstrate American impotence and weakness, right, as a way of preventing or sending a signal to other countries in the region about the new order that's emerging, then it's equally important for the Americans to prove them wrong. And I don't have a good answer as to how we prove them wrong. I mean, a speech by the president saying, for example, that, as he did when he went to Japan, the Senkaku Islands, for the first time a U.S. president has said the Senkaku Islands fall under the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. Other people said it, but the president said that. I mean, what can he do next? He could say, take another step, which I don't believe he will or should, which is, not only will we defend these islands, but we are now prepared to take a position on the sovereignty of the islands. We've heretofore said, we're indifferent to who actually owns them. We could change that position. I don't think that's going to change the Chinese thinking. So then the question becomes, what will get the Chinese to realize that they're on a dangerous course and that they need to change direction?
All right, hold that thought right there. We'll find out what will, if there is a what will, when we come back after the break. Stay with us.
Hello, I'm Martin Despang, and I'm the host together with the one and only Ali Yamashita, and our show is called Urban Transcendence. And Urban Transcendence is about identifying where we have a unique situation of a vibrant city in one of the most beautiful natural environments. So how these two can coincide, sometimes conflict, how they could find reciprocity in the 21st century is what we're excited about. And we're planning on bringing in a diverse body of guests, both from the arts and the science and the established and the wise and the emerging generation. So hope you will join us. We'll always be on Thursdays from 1 to 2 p.m. Thank you.
We're back. You're watching ThinkTech Asia, our program, China's Grand Strategy Disaster. Maybe, maybe not. But with us in the studio is the Executive Director of Pacific Forum, CSIS, Mr. Brad Glosserman, who has actually started a bonfire among thinkers in foreign policy, those experts looking at China. And before the break, Brad, you were talking about the whole difficult question of what will get China's attention. How do we change their thinking? Their perception that they can do what they want to do. They can push where they want to push.
Well, there isn't an easy answer to that. And part of the problem, I mean, I think there are two parts to that, first, actually. The first is that because the Chinese would not agree that they are the problem. You know, they would, I think, take issue with my pugnacious claim that they are the troublemakers, that the Chinese always would claim that they're acting defensively, that they are responding to the slights and intrusions by other countries. And consequently, they would disagree quite greatly, I think, with the way that I framed we started this whole discussion.
Okay, to make a practical example, movement of an oil rig is a defensive measure?
Well, no, I think the Chinese would say that that is, for example, within their rights. That's within their territory. Why they had offered to Vietnam to have discussions, the Vietnamese chose not to.
Okay.
I think a better case would be, for example, in the context of the Senkaku dispute, the Diaoyu dispute, where they would say Japan started this problem by nationalizing the islands in 2011. And that was therefore an escalation that they changed
the status quo.
Okay. So, but there's always a way to discover. I mean, you can always take the chain of events back one step. It's always a question of where you stop. So I think the first thing that the Chinese would do would say that they are not, in fact, the ones that are instigating these problems. The second one is that I think they would take issue with my logic. And they would say that, in fact, and it probably works in tandem with the first argument, but they would say that, you know, we really do seek to come up with a mutually acceptable win-win solution, that we are not using the logic of the Cold War, that we are not seeing this in zero-sum terms, that what we really want here is a relationship of mutual trust. And just as China does not impinge on America's core interests, we would ask that, as a demonstration of mutual respect, a genuine commitment to this new type of major country relations, that the U.S. respect Chinese core interests as well. And so this mutual respect becomes the foundation, if you will, of the entire relationship. And consequently, so to the degree that the United States is prepared to challenge China on any of these questions, it isn't China's fault. It's that the Americans are not respecting Chinese prerogatives, and we have emboldened the Filipinos. We have emboldened the Japanese. We have encouraged the Vietnamese you know, the tail is wagging the proverbial dog. In fact, I've had conversations where Chinese have said to me, we understand the problems you have with Japan because they're the same problems we have with North Korea. You know, that somehow equating the two. And the idea is that somehow the United States is either manipulating or being manipulated by these smaller partners. And therefore, again, China is not to blame. But it becomes a question of, if Hugh White's argument is correct, and people that think like you, China wants to assert its authority in ways that disadvantage the United States. Either the Chinese don't know how to use that language, which I find difficult, or they're just not telling the truth. And there are people that would argue they're not telling the truth. I would argue there's probably cognitive dissonance and that there is a psychological frame that does not allow the Chinese to be the aggressors or the problem makers, and that therefore there will always be a way to reframe the problem such that it's somebody else's fault. Sorry about that.
Well, what about the assumption that China must be making that these smaller countries will never do anything? They'll never rise up.
That's pretty much the bet, I think. And you know, I talk about this with Hugh in our back and forth, that there is this assumption very much that it's all regional security, that it's all about the United States, and that other countries cannot, in fact, come up with a response. And that's my, I mean, there's two elements to this, I think, which are important. I know the time is running short, so I'll try to be brief. The first is, again, in the strategic sense, China, I don't challenge the legality of any of these actions that the Chinese make. And I don't question whether or not they can get away with them, because they are. Okay. My question is that after a 1 week, 1 month time span, what the Chinese have done is bled all the goodwill that they've accumulated over the last couple of decades, that they have raised concerns about Chinese behavior, about Chinese intentions, in such that they will, if you will, you know, they create antagonists all around them. They changed the perception of Japan. Countries that may have thought that Japan might have been the bad guy in the Senkakus and may have been a troublemaking country in some ways. Okay. Now they're inclined to think, well, you know, China messes with our claims, maybe they're messing with the Japanese, maybe we want to get the Japanese involved here. So it becomes a way, if you will, of changing perceptions. That doesn't strike me as being good in China's long-term interests unless China's only concern is brute force. If that's the case, we're in trouble, because that certainly goes against Chinese logic and rhetoric, and I think it goes against their strategic interests. That brings us to the second big point, which is I know where you want to go, and that is the only, to my mind, possible response that's going to work, that I have any hope in, is going to be, it's got to take a large group of countries, Japan, the United States, India, or yeah, perhaps India, Indonesia, Australia, a large group of countries that come together and speak with one voice and put substance behind the rhetoric of what it will take, that China is going too far. That if it's up to the United Americans to act on their own on behalf of every other country, we're in trouble, because we can't respond to that oil well. We have to make it clear, and we means a large constituency of concerned nations, have got to send a signal that Chinese behavior is unacceptable and that there will be consequences to this behavior. If every country acts individually and independently and fails to form this common front, I think China will prevail, that it is calculated that it can do that and that it will work.
What is because you are talking about a conduct that Beijing has engaged in that effectively provides the glue for all these little countries to stick together. But what is it that they do to China by way of that really gets their attention? They have to have a serious embargo, economic change. I mean, a joint statement won't do it, will it?
No, probably not. Although it would probably get the Chinese attention. I mean, this is the same problem we confront with dealing with Russia in Europe. It's the same problem, the collective active problem that you face in the United States, or at the United Nations in terms of any large institution. What has to happen is there's got to be a united front that demonstrates both solidarity and a readiness to bear some costs. And there's been no indication of either of those conditions yet. And the failure to do that means that the responsibility devolves onto the United States. And I don't think that what that means is we have to start shooting at each other to demonstrate the resolve, the commitment. The words aren't going to do it. We would be hard-pressed to say anything more than we have said. So we're in the realm of which we have to send actions. And so you want to send an aircraft carrier group through the South China Sea? That's risky. I'm not sure that's going to necessarily send the signal that get the Chinese attention.
You know, Brad, this is a very provocative conversation and a discussion that will undoubtedly continue for months and perhaps years ahead.
Years.
And we'd like to have you back to further this discussion, probe it even in different ways. But thank you so much for joining us here this evening.
Thanks always for having me. It's always good to be back. Thanks, Dave.
You've been watching ThinkTech Asia, and I'm your host, David Day. Please have a safe drive home. Good night.